Hello, I'm Ben and you're watching The PhD Parent. So the current video was originally motivated by two others. One in which I discuss research investigating perceptions of low milk supply, that is when mum thinks she's not producing enough breast milk, and the other in which I discussed actual low milk supply, that is when mum is not producing enough breast milk. The research in these areas suggests that one way to determine whether milk supply is low is to consider the number of poos and pees that baby is producing per day. The idea is that if these numbers are in the normal range, then that suggests that milk supply may be okay. So the point of the current video was to look at research that provides data on patterns of pooing in infants in the first few weeks and months of life, and to do the same for peeing in a companion video, and you can check out the link to that one down below. Now if you want, you can ignore this video and just look at the figures put out by the American Academy of Pediatrics, who suggest that newborns should poo 3 to 4 times per day when they're 3 to 5 days old, and 3 to 6 times per day when they're 5 to 7 days old. But more interesting to dig into the research, particularly as this goes beyond the relatively short time frame covered by the above recommendations. Now, I was also hoping to review research that investigated the number of poops per day that might serve as a marker for insufficient milk supply, but as far as I can tell, no such research has been conducted. So in the end, the current video provides a general snapshot of pooing across the first 24 months of life. And to be clear, the research reviewed is descriptive, providing insight into the typical patterns of pooping that kids show up to the age of 2 years. It does not provide markers of clinical problems. Now this next bit is important and I'll explain why in a moment. There is an age-old question: when is a poo really a poo? And there are two reasons why the answer to this question is important. The first reason is that variation in the definition of what constitutes a poo will give rise to different patterns of results across studies. In this research area, not all studies provide a definition of a poo, and those that do vary in the definition used. For example, Nyan said that a poo was only a poo if it was bigger than a US 50-cent coin, about 3 centimeters. Srago said that anything bigger than a US quarter, about 2.5 centimeters, was a poo. And in Bakali, everything from a smear to much was considered a poo. How much is much? Good question. And the second reason is that if someone wanted to make use of the data, for example to know whether their kid is pooing more or less than might be expected, such a comparison could not be meaningfully carried out. So I'll provide the definition of a poo where I can. In the following, I've divided the findings of studies by separating them according to a couple of different periods. That is, across studies there was a lot of variability in terms of when pooing habits were assessed, and it was hard to lump things together into neat periods. So I'll start with pooing across the first couple of weeks of life, and then go to the first 6 months, and finally from 6 months up to 2 years. So on to pooing habits across the first 2 weeks of life. So here I came across 4 studies. One study by Griffin and Beattie reported their results in terms of categories. For example, 3 or more poos per day, which isn't helpful, so I ignored this study. So first up was Nyan, who recruited 800 babies, 400 who were breastfed and 400 who were formula fed. As mentioned, a poo was a poo if it was bigger than a US 50-cent coin, about 3 centimeters. In this study, the formula-fed babies pooed a bit more than breastfed babies. However, this difference was only evident in the first couple of days of life, which Nyan attributed to mum's milk not having come in, which usually happens 72 to 96 hours post-birth. In other words, the breastfed babies pooed less because they were consuming less. To simplify the results, I collapsed across the breast and bottle-fed babies, and the results showed that on day 1, kids pooed on average about 3 times per day, and then from days 2 to 7, about 4 times per day. Similar findings were obtained by Srago, who recruited around 70 breastfed infants. As mentioned, a poo was a poo if it was bigger than a US quarter, about 2.5 centimeters. The researchers found that the average number of poos across the first 5 days of life was about 4 per day, with a range of 1 to 7. And across the first 14 days, the average number of poos was about 5 per day, with a range of 1.5 to 8.5. Now you'll notice that the lower end of the range was always greater than 0. This means that every baby pooed at least once per day. In Nyan, however, which was a much larger sample, about 2% of babies did not poo on a given day across the first week of life. So not pooing is uncommon. Finally, Bakali recruited a sample of about 150 infants, the majority of which, 110, were born preterm. As mentioned, poos could range from a smear to much. And they found that in the first week of life, babies born at term pooed on average about 3.5 times per day, and babies born preterm pooed on average about 2 times per day. In the second week of life, both term and preterm babies were pooing on average about 3.5 times a day. So across these studies, it looks like babies poo around 4 times per day during the first couple of weeks of their life, though they'll likely poo less if born preterm, at least in the first week of life. So now on to pooing habits across the first 6 months of life. Now, unlike the previous studies, those looking at pooing habits up to the age of 6 months did so in a way that meant I was able to combine the results using meta-analysis. So I came across 5 studies, but one of them, Fontana, lumped kids into only 2 age categories rather than breaking things down into smaller, more discrete age categories. Consequently, I'm going to ignore this study. The remaining 4 studies were as follows. Now, what I did with these studies was run a meta-analysis that considered data for kids born at term and who were breastfed. When you look at data for bottle-fed kids, in the first couple of months of life, they poo a little less often than breastfed kids, but afterwards there are no major differences. So here are my results, rounded to the nearest 0.5. Now, Bakali also reported the colour of babies' poos. Didn't think this was something I'd be talking about, but anyway, up until the age of 3 months, almost all poos, greater than 90%, were either yellow or green. By 6 months, poos were yellow or green about 80% of the time and brown about 20% of the time. The brown ones are presumably related to the introduction of solid foods, which typically happens when kids are about 6 months old. So finally onto pooing habits when kids are about 6 months to 2 years old. So in this last section, I'll move on to studies that have looked at the older kids. And here I came across 3 studies. In these studies, kids were mostly grouped into categories spanning several months. For example, 7 to 12 months old. So again, what I did with these studies was run a meta-analysis focusing on kids born at term. And here are my results, again rounded to the nearest 0.5. As mentioned, Bakali also looked at poo colour. So by 12 months, for kids born at term, about 25% of poos were yellow or green, 70% were brown, and 5% were orange. So once kids are about 6 months old and up to their 2 years old, they're going to be pooing somewhere between 1 to 2 times per day. Now, 2 years of age is often when kids start toilet training, at least in Western countries. Now, if you'd like to know more about when to start toilet training and when kids typically start to learn toileting skills, you can have a look at my video in the link below. And if you want to know more about the most common toilet training approach, you can check out my other video in the link below. For the moment though, that's it for kids pooing patterns. If there's anything I've gotten wrong, any important research I've overlooked, or if you have any questions, then feel free to get in touch. Otherwise, happy parenting.